You got it, Carolyn? Marilyn, can you do Ruth 1:6? Yes, First Samuel. I didn't mean to wake you up, Marilyn. Ruth 1:6. So, First Samuel 1:8 and then 22. We'll get to that in a little bit. So I better write this down, who's doing what. And let's see. David, if you mind, when we get there, we'll get to Ruth 4, 17 and 22. Walter, does it look like it'll work?
Still loading.
Beg pardon?
Still loading.
Still loading? Well, I made some slides this morning. I was hoping we'd have them. And Walter's doing his best to get out. Let's go ahead and have a prayer and get it started. Bob, would you mind doing a prayer for us this morning?
Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Father, thank you for this class, for teacher, and thank you, Father, for your kindness and mercy and everything. Thank you, Father, for
Amen. Thank you. Warren is not obviously here this morning. Usually he would be resting up this morning because of the Sanders Helpers dinner and auction, but I understand he fell ill recently, so yesterday or so, and had already volunteered to take this Sunday. Warren has been going through the prophets, the quote minor prophets, trying to cover each one a week. But he's not here this week, so we're going to call it Open Mic Sunday. And we're going to take a different tack. We're going to be in the book of Ruth. So we'll go to that. And I want to talk a little bit about Ruth. I hesitate a little bit about doing Ruth because I know probably the women in here, if you've been in a women's class or retreat, what are the books you guys usually go to? There's a lot of Ruth taught, right? Or Esther, or Deborah and the Judges. But I hope maybe we can go over some things I think are worth reminding us out of Ruth. So while we're waiting for those slides to come up, we'll just go ahead and talk about it. Ruth is a short book. There we go. Thank you, Walter. It works. And can you go, once you start it up, go to the second slide? There we go. It's a short book. It's almost like a novella. Not a novel, a short story. It has 4 chapters, about 93 verses in total. So it's not a long book. It starts off with a story. Doesn't have poetry necessarily in it, but it's all the narrative that pushes the story along, that brings up the tension and eventually resolves the conflicts, if you will, in the book of Ruth. It's easily dramatized. I was actually looking up stuff on YouTube, and there was a 1950s movie or show about Ruth. It's pretty dated, but you could see how someone could adapt it to film. And in fact, Ruth was probably meant to be read, and it was read in the synagogues among the people. Who is Ruth written by? Anyone? Beg your pardon? Samuel. We usually take it to be. You cheated? Yeah, Samuel is thought to be the author. Ruth is it doesn't mention in Ruth who specifically the author, and we'll get to those hints in just a minute. But Ruth is also unique in that in the Old Testament, it's one of two books that are written about Gentiles, not Jews. Okay, now Jews are involved in Ruth. The Israelites are involved in Ruth. But the title comes from a Gentile. Not only a Gentile, but a Moabite woman. Okay, so it's about a woman, or the woman is a main character. She's not from Israel, although she gets adopted. She converts, if you will. And she's a Moabitess. Now, what do we know about the Moabites? The Moabites lived where? Southeast, yeah. Just east of the Dead Sea and a little south in Moab. And Moab, if you remember, were the descendants of a man named Moab, who was the son of Lot and his daughter. Okay? You remember after Sodom and Gomorrah, the burning, and the daughters said, we got to have our children. And they went into their father after he was drunk. And two sons were born to one daughter, Moab, who became the country of Moab, southeast, and the Ammonites, okay, Ammon. All right, so those are the descendants. So Moab was founded by something we wouldn't consider a good thing, right? The other thing about the Moabs, the Moabites, a little history, were Israel and Moab on good terms? No. And we'll get to that a bit too. So Ruth is an unusual character, coming from a country, a foreigner, if you will, into Israel. She's a Gentile. She's a Moabitess, and there went the bulb, I guess. So it's written, we think, by Samuel, and here are some hints as to why. Ray, you have Ruth 4:15.
May he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better to you than 7 sons has borne him.
Right. Is better to you than 7 sons. And that's similar language to Samuel 1:8. You have that?
Then said, I can't pronounce that name, her husband to her, Hannah, why weepest thou? And why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am I not better to thee than 10 sons?
Right. So the same kind of construct there. In Samuel, when Hannah's husband, and I can't do his name well either, says, why are you sad? And why is she sad? She did not have any children. And he says, aren't I better to you than 10 sons? And in Ruth, the same construct is used, that Ruth was better to Naomi than 7 sons. So a little bit of a hint there. Samuel 1:22, what does it say?
Do I have that too?
Yes, sir.
But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever.
Thank you. I messed up. What is, let's look up, I think it may be verse 20. Let's see. There is a place in 1 Samuel 1, somewhere around 20. There it is. Verse 19. And Elkanah, I think that's how you pronounce it, knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. That's in the ESV. In others, it'll say the Lord visited her. And so that's a term, the Lord visited her, that's important in Ruth. Marilyn, I think you have Ruth 1:6.
When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-law prepared to return home from there.
Okay. So the Lord provided aid to them. Another translations will say, and the same words are used, the Lord visited his people. So the Lord visited Hannah, the Lord visited his people. So another little parallel, if you will, that would indicate maybe the same author, Samuel, wrote Ruth. And then finally, Ruth 4:17, David.
Also the neighbor women gave him a name saying, there is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David.
And verse 22.
Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David.
Okay. So you got twice there. You went from Naomi, was actually Ruth's son, but Naomi is, given the son, if you will, because she lost her sons earlier, to Obed, to Jesse, to David. Now they just call him David. What was David eventually? The king. He was the king. And so the whole book ends with David, but he's not called the king. Right? It's like we've gone through this whole book talking about Naomi and Ruth, and some Boaz and some other characters, but it ends, if you will, on a hope that's coming, David. Who would know that David is someone special, but is not yet the king? Probably when it was written, and that would have been Samuel. Okay? So those are the indications that Samuel was the author of the book, and the old rabbis held that it was Samuel who was the writer. Other people have proposed other ones, like Eli even, but Eli doesn't really match up well at the time. The other thing is, in the first part of Ruth, it starts off in the time of the judges. Okay? And then it moves on to, if you will, going to David, to the kings. So Ruth is placed in the Hebrew Bible between Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel as a transition between the judges and the kings. Okay? And the king in particular, David. So just a little bit, looks like it was written by by Samuel. And eventually the theme of the book, one of the overriding themes, it was produced and directed by, okay? And we'll get to that in a second. We can go to the next slide when it comes up. But one of the overriding themes is that God directs this whole thing. And it can be I'm going to use a metaphor of scenes here as a play, as a dramatization. And so scenes occur in a place with certain characters at a certain time. And so the first scene occurs, according to Ruth 1, chapter 1, verse 1, in the time of the judges. So it's before Saul, okay? Back around, Samson, Gideon, Deborah, those judges. During that time, you have the place is going to Moab with Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, Chilion, Orpah, and Ruth. And I've got two names highlighted there because they're the main characters of that first chapter, and that's Naomi and Ruth. Now, if we were talking about actually putting on a play, and we had people, Carol, you were playing Naomi, and someone, Cindy, you were playing Ruth, Mark, you were playing Elimelech, something like that. We would go over their characters, right, about what they are. So let's talk a little bit about Elimelech. Elimelech's only mentioned in the first few verses, and his name means, my God is king. Okay? My God is king. Naomi means kind or gentle or pleasant. So if you're playing Naomi, you think, okay, how can I be pleasant or something? Mahlon, the root word for Mahlon is disease. So would you like your name to be, and go around with, hey, disease? Chilion, his name means one who perishes. Okay? What do you think about those names? Why would those names be given? Dave? Contrast good and evil? Yeah. It's also a bit, there's a famine that's been going on in Judah. People tend to name their children after certain events. Maybe that's it. I think here Samuel, writing this looking back, this is a type of foreshadowing. Ray, you're a writer. Would you agree with that? It's, it's a foreshadowing what's about to.
In as much as these are real characters, right?
These are real characters.
Okay, but you asked why
Why the names?
the names, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it could be because they named them because of events. Samuel could be using them as a Malon and Chilion, maybe their nicknames he gives them in the
okay,
book.
that's what I'm getting at. That's what
Yeah.
I needed to hear.
Yeah, and so this is a foreshadowing of what's about to happen to them. They're not going to last long, and they don't. Orpah means fawn or neck, all right? And then Ruth means kind. Let's see, did I get that right? Compassionate friend. Pardon me, she's the compassionate friend. That's what her name means. So you set up with the names, and they start off in Bethlehem, they journey to Moab. Now, what does the name Bethlehem mean? Do you know what Bethlehem means? Lehem, that means house. Beth means bread. Bethlehem means the house of bread. Which is interesting because Jesus was born there, and he's what? The bread of life. Okay? Bethlehem. So the house of bread. And what's contrasting there, in the house of bread, why did they leave the house of bread? Because of a famine. Okay? So they leave and they go to Moab, which is not exactly a place that most Israelites were wanting to go. Amalek, my God, is king. It's almost like he has, he's turning his back on his king and going away from the wings over him. And they go to Moab. What happens in Moab to Amalek? You know the story? He dies, right? Soon thereafter. And they are there, and it says in chapter 1, and I want to just kind of go over some of this. What am I doing here? Is that better? Okay. I'll quit putting my hands up here. In chapter 1, the very first part, Amalek dies. And then Naomi is left with her sons, and they're left without a father. Then they take 2 women as wives for the sons. Orpah, and Ruth, right? And they're both from Moab. Then they live there for 10 years. So they get there, we don't know how long they're there. It looks like it's soon. Amalek dies. Then the sons marry. And after 10 years, what happens to the sons? They die too. Why is that important to someone like Naomi in that time frame? She's without support. Yeah. Without support, and now her children are gone. That means her line is ending. Okay? And we read just a minute ago that Naomi hears that the Lord has visited his people in Judah, and she decides to go home, right? And ideally, Ruth, and we're not going to have time to do it, Ruth should be read orally, and that's the way it was written. At the end of the chapter, I'll tell you why it's done that way. She decides to go home. Orpah and Ruth accompany her. They're on the way, and Ruth does what? Not Ruth. Naomi encourages them to do something, to go back to their people. Because if she says, I'm too old, I will not have any more sons for you. Okay? You go back to your mothers, to your people, and your what? And your gods. Okay? So she's trying to send them home. And the Moabites had a god in particular. It was, it's mentioned in Deuteronomy as Chursum, something like that. Not necessarily the same god the Israelites had. Even though they were related, all the way back up, Abraham and Lot were related. They did not have necessarily the same God. So she's saying, go home to your people, go home to your mothers, find your husbands, go home to your gods. And there's weeping, right? There's weeping on Orpah, there's weeping on the case of Ruth, they're sad, and they want to go with her. And she encourages them again, turn back. Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, Ruth stays. So what does it say about Naomi? That she has 2 daughters-in-law, not of her people,
that want to come with her on the journey. And by the way, probably from where they were in Moab to Bethlehem is about 60 to 70 miles, 7 to 10 days walk. Okay? What does it say to about Naomi?
Must have been a loving, wonderful woman. Someone that compelled, by the way she treated others, what she instilled in others, they wanted to go with her. So Naomi her name means pleasant, gentle, kind. She probably exhibited that, among other things, right? Yeah. Confidence. That she was going to something better. Yeah. At least she was going home. She had nothing left, so she was going home. I should have brought my paper Bible this morning. We could turn right to it. But in Ruth, let's go to chapter 1, and let me see. Verse 11, but Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husband? Turn back. Go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even I should have a husband this night and bear you sons. Would you therefore wait till they were grown?" She was saying, you're going to be in the same situation I am. Just go home. And in verse 14, they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Now understand, in the Hebrew here, the word clung is the same root word we find in Genesis, where a man and a woman shall cling to each other. Okay? And the word is kind of like a glue. They become one flesh. So it's the root word. That's the kind of clinging she was doing. I'm not leaving you. We cannot be separated. And in fact, Ruth goes on to say in verse 16, "Do not urge me to leave you or return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." What does that sound like to you? Yeah, actual family. But a lot of those things that she just vowed, if you will, are like a marriage vow. She is family, and she is not letting go until, in fact, she literally says, "until death do us part," right? And the teaching on the Jewish side is they feel like that's when Ruth was converted to Judaism, but we don't have that in the text. So anyways, that's on the journey back to Bethlehem. In Bethlehem, this is the end of chapter 1, the whole town is noticed that Naomi has come home. And in fact, the women are kind of celebrating. Naomi's back, and she's brought this Ruth with her. What is Naomi's reaction to about, "Don't call me Naomi, call me what?" Name of sadness or bitterness, Mara. Mara comes from their experience as the Israelites in Exodus. They're crossing through the desert, they're thirsty, and they come across a place called Mara, meaning bitter, because the water there could not be drunk. It did not sustain them. It was sadness. It was emptiness. It was the lack of food. It was empty. And so Naomi, at the end of the chapter, says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Lord has been against me." Right? Okay. Anyways, let's go over the other scenes real quick. I want to give you some structure of the first chapter as an example of what it looks like. The women, they're in Bethlehem. Scene 4 is the fields of Boaz. And I should have started this whole thing by saying, "The Lord bless you." Now, wouldn't it be great to hear a greeting like that every time you went to work, David? If your boss came up and said, "The Lord bless you," and everyone in the office said, "And the Lord bless you." Because in chapter 2, when Boaz shows up, that's what he does to his workers. The Lord bless you. Nice greeting. And there you have, in that scene, you have Boaz, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz are the main characters. You have the servant over the reapers who explains this. Then you have the women in the field who Boaz says, stay next to the young women and stay with them. And I've informed the young men to leave you alone. Okay? The fifth scene is the threshing floor at night. All right? After Boaz and them have worked all day to thresh the barley, and they would have probably been just outside town. You didn't have a threshing floor in town, and you usually did it late in the afternoon because the wind picked up. You picked it up, and it went up into the air. The seeds, the heads would fall, and the chaff would blow. And you didn't want that in town, right? And you did it later in the afternoon when the wind picked up. All right, I did it again, Mark. There we go. The next scene is the city gate with Boaz, the elders, and the first Redeemer. And then finally, if you will, there's a narration at the end about redemption, marriage, a child, and the generations that come from Perez to David. Walter, next slide, please. To give you a little bit of how chapter 1, and we think of this as a story, but there's a certain, go to the one before that. Yeah, there you go. That didn't format the way it did on my computer, but that's okay. Chapter 1 has a certain structure, and it starts off with famine. It ends with a harvest of barley. Okay? So a contrast. In the second part, it talks about going to Moab. Near the end, they're coming back to Bethlehem. Okay? About the third point, Naomi means pleasant and gentle. When she gets back to Bethlehem, she is bitter and empty. Okay? In between there, during the journey, you have the encouragement of Naomi telling her daughters-in-law to go home. They're refusing. She encourages again. One goes home, one stays, and makes this vow in the narrative that they're family and they're glued together. You're starting off here, and you have a contrast here, and it comes in, and it comes in, and it comes in, and it forms this part of an X. And that's called a chiasmus, or chiastic structure. We call it that. We don't know what they called it. But you'll find that in biblical literature where things are encompassed within, they're nested within each other. Okay? And that's chapter 1. And that happens also in the other chapters as well. Many times when you have a nested structure like that, in the middle is the important part. And in the middle here, when you get down to it, is what Ruth does with Naomi. That's the point, if you will, of chapter 1. And her point is, going with Naomi, your people will be my people. I will die where you die. I'll be buried where you die. Your God will be my God. Now, what is Ruth's background that would prevent her from wanting to go to Israel? Yeah, the Moabites are against the Israelites. They're not friends. And in fact, in Deuteronomy, it says Moses gives the law that the Moabites are not to go into the temple for 10 generations, basically forever. Okay? You are not to have anything to do with the Moabites. You are not to marry them, which these sons did. Okay? And he goes on to explain why. The Moabites, who are considered relatives, did not meet you on the road with bread to feed you when you came to the land. Okay? In fact, they hired a prophet, Balaam, to come and curse you, right? Even so, Balaam couldn't do it. The Lord wouldn't let him and blessed them instead. Okay? The Moabites were not welcoming, and as a result of not taking care of their brother, not taking care of their neighbor, they're not to have anything to do with them. In fact, the Edomites, who were also neighbors and relatives, they were to treat them well, but not the Moabites and the Ammonites. So there's a reason here for Naomi to be reluctant to go to Israel. Okay? Does she have a husband? No. She has a mother-in-law. Will she be protected? Maybe not. Okay, she is a foreigner into a land that does not welcome her nation, her people. But she does it anyway. She goes off because, one, I would say she loves Naomi, right? And as a result of that love, she steps out in what? She steps out in faith that it'll be okay, all right? So, if you will, this book is about moving on to the kings, but for us, it's the root of the gospel. Someone stepping out in faith and depending and putting their faith in God and in the people around her. Okay. Next slide, Walter. So themes and points to the whole story, through this whole drama. The Lord is directing the actions through relationships of people. Love, loyalty, and faith, in particular, Ruth 1, 16 and 17, where Ruth says those vows, I will stay with you. And then redemption and redeemer. The number one term used throughout the book, most often, is redeemer. And it's not introduced until after chapter 2, okay, in the latter part of the book. So the part of the book starts off with this terrible time, traveling back, being empty. And then in chapter 2, Ruth says, we need food, and she goes to a field to glean. Now, what is the law when it comes to gleaning, to harvesting fields and grain? What did Moses tell them to do? When something drops, do you pick it up? No. Why? So other people could come and get it. In particular, the poor people and the foreigner. Okay? And so she goes to this field, and as it so happens, it belongs to a guy named Boaz, which is a wonderful name. I worked with someone, I need to get back in the camera, I guess. I worked with someone whose last name was spelled Boaz, and I said, oh, so your last name is Boaz? She went, no, it's Bose. So when I look at it, I think of Bose, but we always pronounce it as Boaz. And Boaz is the one who greets his workers as the Lord may bless you. The Lord bless you. And is known as a righteous man. So he asked the supervisor of the reapers, who's the young woman out there? And he explained she got here early. She's the daughter-in-law of Naomi. And she's been here since early. Now it's late, and she's been doing all this work. So Boaz says, and calls her up, stay close to my women. And I've told the young men not to bother you. Okay? So now she's getting some of that protection. And she goes back to Naomi, and Naomi puts a connection. What is the connection of Boaz with her? The relatives of her husband. In fact, the same clan of Amalek. Some of the old teachings, the rabbis say he may have been even a brother of Amalek. In fact, in some translations it says he talks to the other redeemer, our brother Amalek's wife Naomi. Okay? But it could have meant clan. They were closely related. And again, in the Mosaic law, what is a brother to do for the wife of a husband who's lost her husband? Marry her. Yes, Dennis?
Raise children for him.
Raise children for him. Right. So Naomi puts it together. That's a close one, and that can be a redeemer. And then we get into the part in the next scene in chapter 3 where Naomi and Ruth, especially Naomi, says, look, this is what I want you to do. Tonight, I want you to bathe. I want you to put on your cloak, all right, something nice, if you will. And there's some indication here that what Ruth may have been wearing at that point was still her widow's dress or signal. It could have been something she wore to say, I'm a widow. Put that away. She's now available to marry. Go to the threshing floor and wait until Boaz goes to sleep. Go and uncover his feet and lay down there. Something you would do?
Back then,
Uh-huh.
oftentimes the master of the house would have a servant person lay at his feet.
Keep him warm. Good point.
And where was Boaz when this was happening? He was threshing floor next to the grain, next to the pile of grain. It says they had eaten and he'd made merry. He had some drink. Okay? So it was a hard day of work and a good day of eating and drinking and enjoying the blessings given to him. And he went to sleep, threshing floor next to the grain. She shows up and sleeps at his feet. And it says about midnight he turns over. And to his surprise, there's a woman there. In chapter 2, there's an interesting point. It says, Ruth, we've heard everything about you and what you've done for your mother-in-law, Naomi, how you're taking care of her, and that you are, and the King James calls it, a virtuous woman. You remember that? Ruth is called, you're a virtuous woman. And he blesses her and says, may the Lord of Israel spread his wing over you. So in the middle of the night, when Boaz wakes up and there's a woman there, who are you? She said, it's me, Ruth. You are our Redeemer, reminding him of the law. And she says, please spread your wing over us. So uses his words and says, you're the person to do it. And reminds him that you're the Redeemer under the law. And he's impressed, right? Barbara, how is he impressed? What?
One, that she would know that, and two, that she was a young woman, and he may have been a little bit older, and yet she was like saying, I'm here for you.
Right. One of the things that didn't dawn on me until later is, when I was growing up and dating, you're choosing this girl maybe, and it's really the girl that chooses you, right? And in this case, she did. He says, you didn't go after the younger men, which implies that he's older, and she could have. She could have followed riches, he said, but you came here. And he blesses her. He's impressed. And he says, I will do everything you ask. I will redeem you. All right, a couple of things before we go further with the marriage. Well, no, we'll get to the marriage. We'll get a couple of things on Ruth. So Ruth goes home before it's daylight. Didn't want to be a scandal that this woman be seen with him on the threshing floor. She leaves before it's light. Goes home and tells Naomi what happened, and Naomi says, he'll do it all. Okay? All right. So in the last part where he does redeem them, he goes to the city gates. That's one of the near the end of the book, the last scenes. And he grabs the elders for witnesses. And he says, there is a closer redeemer, which means a relative that's closer than me. There's someone between us, right? He waits at the city gate. That Redeemer comes and he says, friend, please sit over here. He gets the elders and he asks him, Perry, if you're the Redeemer, Naomi has returned and we're looking, someone needs to redeem her land, her property. And his response is, I'll do it. Right? He's the first in line. I'll do it. And then Boaz says, okay, you get the property and Naomi, and by the way, the daughter-in-law who you have a responsibility to. And so that Redeemer says, oh, wait a minute. And in fact, he says, I don't want to put my inheritance at jeopardy. You do it. So how would you put your inheritance at jeopardy by having to marry Ruth? She wasn't an Israelite. That's one issue. Perhaps he was already married with children. And if he has a child with Ruth, her child will actually be part of the line of Amalek. okay? And that child will be able to claim the land. So he will invest in it. He would invest in his family. He would invest in raising them up. But then it would be separate from, and it could dilute his inheritance. In other words, he would spend time on something that would not help him economically later. Okay? It would, and maybe his inheritance would crumble away. So there's a risk for him, which means there's also a risk for Boaz, although we have no indication he was married, had no indication that he had other children. Boaz says, fine, I will do it. All right. So Boaz does. He marries Ruth. And then the Lord visits her, if you will. She conceives, and she gives birth to a male child. And does she name him? No. The women of Bethlehem name him. And they name him Obed. And they're all happy for her. Because now she has, like Job, she lost her family. Like Job, she has regained her family. Like Job, she was empty. She did not have anyone to work her land to take care of her. And now she is blessed with a grandson. And it says there, they put the baby in her lap, and she becomes the nurse for this baby. She helps raise him. And so she's blessed. The book ends with two generational statements that Obed was father of Jesse, who was the father of David. All right, so she's the grandmother of David, and it's mentioned it twice. The other theme here is from Christians. When we get to Matthew 1, who are the women noted in the descendants of the Messiah, of Jesus? Mary. Who else? The women in Jesus' genealogy. Rahab, Ruth, and Tamar. Okay? And in fact, in Ruth, the men of Bethlehem say, may Ruth be like Tamar, but actually, pardon me, Rachel, and build up your house. Okay? And so that's what she's doing. She is in line to the Messiah. Okay. So next slide, Walter. I'm finally getting to some questions I want to ask you guys. Going through all that, Ruth did not have a child in her first marriage for 10 years. No children. Okay? Why is that important in this story? Would not have been in Jesus' lineage. For us, that was, Ruth would not have been in Jesus' lineage had she had children. Because she would have had children, there would have been no reason for a relative to redeem her, marry her, and give her children. For 10 years, okay? She was, quote, barren. What does it mean? Naomi goes to Moab with her husband, loses everything. But she comes back with a daughter-in-law. And that daughter-in-law ends up as an ancestor to the king, which, you know, is part of the reason for this book. But then for the king in Matthew 1. What I'm suggesting is that Ruth was picked. What is the name of the first redeemer? Has the first bell gone off? Oh, man. Who is the name of the first redeemer that declined to marry Ruth? What was his name? No clue. No clue. But we know Boaz, and he's mentioned in Luke and in Matthew as an ancestor to the Messiah. Okay? Ruth was picked. Boaz had the opportunity, and he's remembered. But the guy who gave up the opportunity, we don't know who he is. Why was the telling of Ruth important at the time? Because David was coming. Why is it important later? Because the Redeemer was coming later. And that Redeemer also had to have a cost, right? Boaz had a cost. He had to take care of this other family, raise a family to another line, if you will, but he's remembered for that. This Redeemer that would come in Matthew would also have a cost to buy us, right? Why is Ruth being a Moabite important? because it grafted a Gentile into the people of God. Okay? Not the only one. Boaz was the grandson of Rahab, also a Gentile, grafted into the people of God. And finally, I will say this, one final point. The words used in Hebrew for virtuous woman or a worthy woman in Ruth, when Boaz says that, is only used twice more in the Old Testament. And they're both in Proverbs 12 and 31, where one says a virtuous woman is a blessing to her husband and is more precious than rubies. And the other one is a virtuous woman who sits at the gate and buys property and does these other things. The only time it's used. Who wrote Proverbs? Yeah, Solomon. So the great-grandson of Ruth had probably heard her story and was related. So when you look at that, you think Ruth. Okay, so that's it for Ruth. I hope y'all got something out of it. Sorry for the delay.